All good. It's all good at the moment.
Fantastic.
The invite didn't come through, but I managed to find one anyway, so it's okay.
Cool. All right. So you ready to go, Ted?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Good. All right. Welcome along, everyone, for another progress review. Today we've got Ted Henniker, who's going to talk to us about evaluating von Hippel and Trivers' adaptive theory of self-deception. You've got the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pete. All right. So I was in the School of Education for 9 months. I've now moved to the other school, so that's just a note. So the problem statement. So what we believe is really important and affects our lives in all kinds of ways. Sometimes people do have irrational beliefs, though, and I haven't specifically defined that at the moment. We'll come back to that. I'm just using a general idea like counterproductive, harmful, self-destructive, that kind of thing. And the example here from the philosopher Alfred Meal in his 1997 paper, he says people who falsely believe in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary that their spouses are not having affairs, their children are not using illicit drugs, or that they themselves are not seriously ill. So I'm interested in explaining why this sort of stuff occurs. We need a theory of irrationality to do that. There's a really old one here, which is kind of funny, that I've put here as an example of what one of those might look like. Here we go. Richard Gilpin from 1677, he says, "It's unimaginable that someone can properly and formally intend to deceive himself. Deceit then, being not from sin nor ourselves properly, can find out no other parent for itself than Satan." I think that's kind of funny. So my research aim is to evaluate and build upon theories of irrationality, and we'll talk about the rationale for that on the next slide. And for this chapter 1, I'm trying to evaluate von Hippel and Trivers' theory, and that is the theory that self-deception is a biologically adaptive capacity. So the rationale for all of this, in part, is this theory crisis that we have in psychology. I've talked about this at the education conference earlier at UQ, so I've got some slides there if anyone's interested. But it can be summarised with this quote here from Mischel. He says, "Psychologists treat other people's theories like toothbrushes. No self-respecting person wants to use anybody else's." That's kind of the problem we're working with. Now, in response to that, some psychometrics researchers have created something called theory construction methodology in response. That's for quality control and also for supporting best practices in psychology as well. So there's 5 steps to this process. The first is to identify relevant phenomena, that is correlations and patterns with data. That's just statistical work as well as pattern recognition. Step 2 is to formulate a proto-theory. That's just speculating for a potential explanation for the phenomena. Step 3 is to formalize the theory and phenomena into a model. Now, this in the original paper they talked about mathematically formalizing it, but that's not actually necessary. Other people have responded to that, giving an example of Darwin's theory. That was not mathematically formalized originally. It still was a very good theory. So the important thing is to specify the logical and the semantic structure. Step 4 is to check adequacy of the formal model, and you can do this with a computer, for example, by trying to generate the phenomena with the model. There are other ways of doing that as well. Step 5 is to evaluate the theory, and that is assessing the explanatory power of the theory. There are a number of different ways of doing that as well. This is designed for theory construction, but you can use it for theory evaluation as well. You just put it in step 2. So for step 1 and step 2, theory construction methodology, it's pretty easy for what I'm looking at. So we can just use this quote earlier as an example of the sort of phenomena that we're looking at here, that we just went over earlier. Step 2, we can just put the theory in that exists already from von Hippel and Trivers. And step 3 is where the work really starts. So formalizing the theory and phenomena into a model. As I said, it's not necessary to do this with maths, but we do need to find an appropriate method for doing this. So what I've chosen to do is what I am calling syllogistic decomposition. A syllogism is a block of informal logic composed of premises. Now, I need to check my understanding of this. I just had a conversation with Peter about this, but just work with me for the moment. Syllogistic decomposition is coined by me, and it's just analogous to functional decomposition that you see in physics and engineering and stuff, involving breaking down a complex mechanism into its functional components for the purpose of analysis. Functional just meaning this does something. The example I've given here is a hydraulic ram in a bulldozer where it has the function of adjusting the blade. So you could use that as an example of a component. So syllogistic decomposition is quite analogous to this. It involves breaking a theory into its constituent syllogisms for the purposes of analysis. So a certain syllogism, premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, could be a logical component of a certain theory. This should be a replicable process. One of the things that the theory crisis and replication crisis in psychology really brought to the fore is the need to be able to redo methods sections, I suppose. And we'll look now at some examples with this particular theory from von Hippel and Trivers. So this is just an overview of the conclusions that I've ended up with here. The first conclusion is that sometimes people believe falsehoods because of a desire for their truth. The second is that that process can be properly called self-deception. The third is that self-deception is not paradoxical. It doesn't need intent. And then we've got, from not just from von Hippel, but from Alfred Mehl, who's a philosopher that they're citing for their theory. He says that saying people intentionally deceive themselves is unwarranted, even if it's technically possible, because there's a lot of philosophers that say that it is a paradox. And he also says that the definition of self-deception doesn't need intent, which resolves the paradox. And you can see that's consistent with the von Hippel and Trivers' third conclusion there. And then von Hippel and Trivers' core conclusion is that self-deception is adaptive. That is, it's been selected for by evolutionary processes. Now, I'm not going to go over this, but this is just what my full results look like with all the premises as well. And then in the red box there is the stuff that is from Alfred Mehl. We'll go over that now as we analyse it. So just a nice and quick one for the first syllogism. The first premise here is that people can believe falsehoods to be true. That's pretty easy to evidence. And same with the second one, people can desire falsehoods to be true. The third one's a little bit more complex, and that's the idea that beliefs can be directly caused by desires. We do have evidence for this, though, in the psychological literature. Selective interpretation is an example of that. Motivated forgetting is another example of that. And the motivated cognition literature, which Ziva Kunda here has talked about in her 1990 paper. A lot of that is discussed there. And then the conclusion is that sometimes people believe falsehoods because of their desire for a truth here. And that seems to be reasonable based on what we know there. Syllogism 2 gets a little bit more troublesome. So premise 4 is that deception involves convincing people of falsehoods. And the idea here is that we talk about intent later on. So the problem with this is first of all, involves is an ambiguous word to use here, but I needed to use it in order for putting these syllogisms together in order for it to make sense and follow their theory. But let's just assume that they mean requires, so that we have compatibility with the conclusion they're trying to get to. If we do that, then it ends up being an overgeneralization. And the reason for that is that deception is not the same thing as lying. Lying is just one of 4 methods available to do deception. We have revealing lies, revealing truths, concealing lies, and concealing truths. And this comes out of the military deception literature, which is pretty interesting because they have to apply this knowledge. So a more inclusive definition, and same with the philosophical literature on deception. A more inclusive definition is that deception is intentional misdirection. So lying there would be a subset of deception, one of 4. The fifth premise is that we're convincing people of falsehoods when we convince ourselves of falsehoods. And that the kind of underlying assumption there is that convincing the self is essentially the same process as convincing others. That's true, but I think in context this looks like a false equivalence because of the vagueness of the word people. So premise 4 should be able to read, deception involves convincing other people of falsehoods, because then self-deception proponents could add to that, self-deception involves convincing the self of falsehoods. But then in order for our conclusion here to stand, premise 5 needs to say that we're convincing others of falsehoods when we convince ourselves of falsehoods, which would be a contradiction. So if we specify that too much and get rid of the vagueness, we end up with the idea that this is like a weasel word. So conclusion 2 is the idea that the cognitive process that we talked about on this previous page, where people believe falsehoods because of a desire for their truth, can be properly called self-deception, and I don't think that's a valid argument because because of what we talked about here, the phenomenon needs to have probably a different name or a different conceptualization in order for this to work. We get to the third syllogism, and that's the idea that self-deception is not paradoxical and doesn't need intent. So von Hippel, the first premise here is that it's paradoxical for a person to intend to deceive themselves. So von Hippel and Trivers cite Mehl, this other philosopher, who says that this kind of intentionalist, as he calls it, self-deception theories are either paradoxical or involve hidden intentions sort of mechanisms for which he says there's no real evidence. The problem is that von Hippel and Trivers don't really go into this. So in premise 4 back here, the idea that deception involves convincing people of falsehoods, we saw that regular deception requires intent with this more inclusive definition that we gave. And premise 6 that we're just talking about here says that self-deception can't have intent. But von Hippel and Trivers later claim in their paper that regular deception and self-deception are, quote, directly comparable, hence tying self-deception to processes that have already been studied in interpersonal deception. This is really confusing. It seems like a contradiction. In fact, Mill even criticises this idea from the first line of his abstract. He says self-deception is made unnecessarily puzzling by the assumption that it's an intrapersonal analogue of ordinary interpersonal deception. So premise 7 is the idea that despite premise 6, a person can still be deceived in the mere sense of being mistaken. And this comes from Alfred Mill. We'll talk about this later on. It's true, and Mill uses it to buttress a certain argument, but we'll get back to that in a moment. But basically, von Hippel and Trivers' views in this syllogism are quite unclear. We need to actually look at Mill's paper because they cite that for their conceptual understanding to check their arguments in detail to see if the theory can be pieced together coherently. So we've got time to analyse 2 extra syllogisms here, and that's S3.1 and S3.2. I may change the terminology for that, but we'll just call them at 3.1 and 3.2 for now. So premise 6.1 is the idea that it's only possible for someone to intentionally deceive themselves if their intentions are hidden from them. And Mill gives the example of using a forgetfulness mechanism or some kind of unconscious Freudian kind of mechanism. And so the immediate thing we have is if we're aware of our own tricks, it seems inconceivable that we could be deceived by them. If I try to put my phone here and then go, oh, where did it go? It doesn't really make sense because I'm aware of what I've done. But Mill has a thought experiment to get around this. He calls it Ike the Forgetful Prankster. And this, I think, illustrates a plausible mechanism utilising forgetfulness, and I've illustrated it on the next page. It's a bit silly, I think, and maybe a little unfathomable about why someone would do this, but I think he has successfully provided a counterexample to the idea that intentionally deceiving the self is paradoxical. Mill also doesn't rule out this Freudian kind of idea of the hidden unconscious motives kind of stuff as well, but he says there's no evidence for that. He says it's unwarranted. So P7.1 is that despite the hidden intentions mechanism being sound, the paradigmatic cases of self-deception that are talked about in the literature don't actually invoke it. Mill talks about garden variety examples of self-deception, and those don't involve these kinds of elaborate mechanisms, nor do case studies discussed in the literature more broadly. And an example of that is Robert Trivers' book here. Maybe Jason can see that. The Deceit and Self-Deception book that he wrote. So C3.1 is that saying people intentionally deceive themselves is unwarranted, even if it's technically possible. That's pretty much Mill's argument here. And that seems reasonable based on what he's described there. So the mechanism looks like this, the Ike the Forgetful Prankster. So Ike is this guy who wants to trick himself, I don't know why, but he likes to mimic other people's handwriting, and he's very good at it. So he forges a diary entry. And so there's 2 possible conditions here. One of them, and Ike is also aware that he's a very forgetful guy, and that he can probably exploit that to trick himself. So in the top condition, we just have he remembers that he forges it and the deception fails. So Ike is Ike the whole way through. In the second one, we can think of Ike breaking into 2 different agents, where in the middle he's got his episode of forgetfulness. So Ike 0 is deceiving Ike 1 successfully because he's had his episode of forgetfulness.
Just incidentally, that is exactly the plot device in the Christopher Nolan film Memento.
I love it.
I'm sorry.
Maybe it came from Alfred Mill.
Yeah, anyone who's not seen the film, but he deceives himself.
That's amazing. Successful.
The whole film away.
Spoilers. I have watched it,
Yeah,
but yeah. So S3.2, this is the 3.2 syllogism. This is the idea that we don't need intent and we can resolve the paradox. So the way that Mill does this is he says, first of all, that you can deceive yourself without any intent. You can be deceived without any intent in the mere sense of being mistaken. And he cites the Oxford English Dictionary for this, and I don't really want to disagree with that. I think that's fair enough. And then P7.2, he says, self-deception can be reasonably defined as roughly meaning self-mistaken. He actually doesn't say this outright because I think it looks rather silly. But what he does is he kind of infers this. The problem here is, and you can't get to his conclusion without it. So the problem here is this idea of reasonable. Removing intent removes all the novel explanatory force from the theory. Calling someone self-mistaken sounds ridiculous. It reduces to just being mistaken or perhaps a victim of bias. And there's a more crucial issue here too, which is that removing intent demolishes the sole remaining mechanism by which self-deception can be said to occur. And that's the Ike stuff and the Freudian sort of hidden intentions stuff. Either that's a plausible foundation for a self-deception theory to be built upon, or this premise is true. Mill doesn't actually address that problem or seem to be aware of it. And the conclusion 3.2, the definition of self-deception doesn't need intent, resolving the paradox, I think is unreasonable. The logic seems fine, but the evidence doesn't really support the conclusion there. So I've drawn a little meme, of course, to sort of illustrate this. Self-deception theory, I deliberately fool myself into believing lies for profit. Quite elaborate there. And self-mistaken theory is sometimes I get things wrong, I guess. You know, it's not really quite as impactful. S4, this is the core sort of claim that von Hippel and Trivers are making, and that's the idea of self-deception being adaptive. Oh, sorry. Hold on. There we go. So we've got this first premise, deceiving others is biologically adaptive. And Robert Trivers argues that quite forcefully in this book. And I think he's got lots of good examples from nature about, and not just from nature, but also looking at the adaptive function of that stuff. It seems reasonable. I can definitely buy that idea. He has lots of good examples. P9 is that self-deception facilitates the deception of others. This I don't think is even false, because at this point of the analysis, we don't have a coherent concept or a theory of self-deception to work from in making this claim. So I think it's meaningless. C4 is that self-deception is therefore adaptive and has been selected for by evolution. There's two issues here. First of all is the issue inherited from the previous premise, where it's meaningless. But the other issue is, we'll get to in a moment, but there's other possible explanations here from an evolutionary perspective. So Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin in 1979 wrote a paper called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. And these guys are philosophers of biology and biologists. They said, we wish to question a deeply ingrained habit of thinking among students of evolution. We call it the adaptationist program, the near omnipotence of natural selection in forging organic design and fashioning the best among possible worlds. This program regards natural selection as so powerful and the constraints upon it so few that direct production of adaptation through its operation becomes the primary cause of nearly all organic form, function, and behaviour. Constraints upon the pervasive power of natural selection are recognised, of course, but they are usually dismissed as unimportant, or else, and more frustratingly, simply acknowledged and then not taken to heart and invoked. 30 years later, a biologist by the name of Nielsen summarised the effect of this paper on the field. He said, evolutionary biologists are today arguably much more reluctant to invent adaptive stories without direct evidence for natural selection acting on the traits in question. We still regularly encounter very naive adaptive stories, particularly about human behaviour, but rarely in journals with high standards of peer review. Philosopher of biology Elizabeth Lloyd, I really like her work. She describes all of this too in her meta-scientific work on evolutionary psychology. She says it seems that the ostensible links to evolutionary biology rather than the experimental evidence are doing much of the work of eliminating rival psychological hypotheses. Once the exaggerated and ill-reasoned claims are removed, the experiments usually appear to support a non-evolutionary psychological theory at least as strongly. In fact, none of the usual burdensome evidentiary requirements for an evolutionary hypothesis are even attempted. Evolutionary psychologists are primarily using evolutionary theory to attempt to eliminate other competing theories within psychology without regard to, and in fact in violation of, the standards of evolutionary biology. There's a history of what Nielsen is calling very naive applications to evolutionary biology in social and psychological research. A really good example is this critique of terror management theory from Kirkpatrick and Navarrete. I love the title, Reports of My Death Anxiety Have Been Greatly Exaggerated. That's a really good paper for anyone who's interested. There is also a raging debate between what's called standard evolutionary theory and the extended evolutionary synthesis that's going on as well in the background here, which is not really addressed. And SET is associated with what Gould and Lewontin called adaptationism, whereas EES is associated with the study of byproducts, acceptations, multi-level selection, a bunch of other biological stuff there. Racine has a really good paper detailing this, and he places Robert Trivers quite explicitly in the SET camp with people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Steven Pinker, the sort of new atheist crowd. And there's evo-psych theories like this one, which are harder to argue under EES because the standards of evidence get a bit stricter, or quite a lot stricter. So in summary, the first conclusion I think works. The second conclusion I don't think does. Third one is really weird. It's kind of, we don't really know what they think there. Fourth one, yep. Fifth one, no. Sixth one, no. Limitations, implications, and further research. Need to contextualize all this with a lit review on irrationality, because that's quite a philosophical topic in itself. There's always more literature to look at. This presentation and chapter only concerns the 2011 publication by them. In terms of implications, I think we should probably stop using the term self-deception and its synonym self-delusion for this reason. And there's no point going past the step 3 in TCM based on that finding. What we have to do instead is restart with a new theory. Possible case study here in theoretical questionable research practices, and best practices could be improved maybe with this information. In terms of further research, there's process versus output models. This model is very much an output-based model. If you define something as a falsehood, well, that has to come from somewhere cognitively. And so it's not really a process model. So that could be a weakness of the theory as well. Self-deception theory may also be incompatible with group and multi-level selection. I do not have time to go into that. And there's an ethical issue with this theory too, which I think is probably something you find in a lot of evolutionary psychology, which is that it provides a rationalization, even if that's not what the scientists themselves are saying, for harmful deception. So in terms of conclusions, I don't think they've demonstrated engagement with the deception literature, and the questionable research practice in question there is inaccurate referencing of ideas and concepts. Their reasoning for why people believing falsehoods due to a desire for their truth can be properly called self-deception doesn't hold. Self-deception needs a new name at the very least, more likely an entirely new conceptualization rather than being based on this interpersonal deception analogy. Their argument's inconsistent about the nature of intent and falls apart there. They've incorrectly cited Mill's conceptual paper, I believe, which is inaccurate referencing again. I appear to have fallen for the adaptationist fallacy, as many evolutionary psychologists do, presupposing that a trait has an adaptive function just because it exists, and they haven't really engaged with that at all. So that's failing to report or discuss relevant contrary evidence. In terms of Mill, his first conclusion seems to be valid and sound. I think it's a really interesting and a good argument, actually. The second one doesn't seem to hold, though. With regards to evaluating theories of irrationality, this one doesn't make it past step 3, but it's not the last one. There's more to look at. So the next proto-theory I want to look at is Kunder's motivated cognition theory, and I think that's a really promising one. I've got some selected references here as well. So thanks for listening to my talk. That's the end.
Cool, thanks very much for that, Ted.
There's Jason.
We've now got a few moments to do questions, so I'll hand around the mic so Jason can hear it too. Are there any questions from the audience? Misha?
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Ted. Really interesting. I just had a very small question. You discussed 4 methods of deception, and one of those is revealing truth. Mm-hmm. How can that be deceptive?
Should I use the microphone?
No, you've got...
Oh, this one, yeah. That's a great question. One example of this is something called paltering, which is where you reveal true and irrelevant information to throw someone off the scent. So, for example, a politician might be asked whatever question, they could say, well, some other irrelevant information, and as a result, deceive through omission the asker of the question. That's an example of that. There's also stuff like decoys in military history and other stuff like that.
Okay, thanks.
I have a very quick question for Ted as well. Because I don't see on your slides, so I would like to ask what is the ontological as well as epistemological positions of yours that have informed this study?
Oh, the ontological position, that's TBD. The whole point of all of this is to figure out what I believe. So in terms of the epistemology and the ontology, the whole purpose of this methodology is to try to work towards figuring that out. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Ed. Very quickly, you mentioned that you're looking, one of the next steps is to have a look at the irrationality literature. Just wondering what you're looking for and what you think you might find.
That's a great question. the first reason I need to look at the irrationality literature is to provide a bit more structure to why I'm choosing to ask the questions that I'm asking, and also a bit more systematization to which theories I might be interested in looking at. I mean, next on my radar is motivated cognition theory, because it's quite well known, it's very well cited. But there may be some others too, and it'd be good to get them in scope as well and figure out exactly. I mean, in PhDs, we're always figuring out more why we want to ask what we ask and stuff over time. But yeah, I'm hoping to get a bit more clarity about the broader context for my research by doing that.
I was just wondering why you put all the phenomena associated with self-deception under irrationality. I mean, one of the examples you gave of the prime ones was people thinking that their spouses are not having affairs.
Yeah, this quote here.
Evidence to the contrary. That seems like, I mean, sometimes it's going to be rational, but sometimes it just seems like it's going to be rational depending on the desires and the values of the person. So, is it the case that really self-deception doesn't neatly fit as a sort of subcategory of irrationality?
I definitely think that's plausible. Irrationality is not something I have a strong foundation in. I'd really like to improve my foundation in that. I mean, this work can stand alone, of course, just as an evaluation of self-deception, but I would really like to learn about that, because people use the term irrationality all the time, particularly in economics, with behavioral economics coming about as a kind of way of responding to this kind of classical, rational choice theory stuff and all the rest of it. So I think that's a question that is I'm hoping to find out more about. I'd really like to learn.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. Are you going to look at Freudian ideas? How do you might explain? Or
I would love to. I would absolutely love to. The problem with Freud, though, is I don't think he was really strong on his semantics. He had some great ideas when it comes to psychoanalysis and defense mechanisms, particularly, which fit really nicely with this. And in fact, some of this other work kind of seems to be compatible with theories of self-deception, motivated cognition theory. A lot of that actually appears to be compatible with some of Freud's ideas. The big amount of work that would be involved in bringing Freud into this conversation would be digging through and clarifying exactly what he meant with various... Because there's also Anna Freud, too, who wrote a lot about the same stuff. So it would be almost like a historical project to go through there.
because I was just thinking, with psychodynamic theory, there could be an avenue there for conceptualizing the self as having different parts, which in some senses could resolve the paradox if one
Precisely.
perceiving the other.
Yeah, Mill makes that exact same point. He says that is plausible, but he says at the moment no one's provided any evidence, so he says it's not really worth my time at the moment. But it's plausible and it's worth exploring.
Are there any other questions that anyone wants to ask while we've got Ted up in front of me? No? Okay, if there's no more questions, let's all thank Ted.
Thanks for coming, everyone.